Hi, and thank you for joining me for another short lecture. And today I'm going to confront an area that, if incorrectly understood, could slowly but surely destroy the whole purpose of the Jewish experiment. And friends, I know I say this a lot on how important a given lecture may be, and it's not that I'm overemphasizing or exaggerating the value of these issues, but rather that there is just so much in Torah Judaism that, if misunderstood, could completely socially knock ethical progress off its intended axis. And friends, the same holds true with today's topics, which are Yeridos HaDoros, or how Ashkenazim say it, Yeridos HaDoros, and Daas Torah. Now let's quickly begin with Yeridos HaDoros, which literally means the decline of the generations, or the generational decline. Now this is the belief that since Har Sinai, Jewish humanity has been on a decline, not just mentally and ethically, but spiritually as well. A decline, as it is taught today, that it's unpreventable. In other words, people who believe in this, as a rule, also believe that someone from a later generation could never surpass someone from a previous one, either in Torah, halacha, or in spiritual matters. And not because of circumstance, but because of some sort of principle. And friends, it was this idea of Yeridos HaDoros, the generational decline, that then gave birth to the notion we have today of Daas Torah. The idea that although we are in this uncontrollable, unpreventable decline, there exists a handful of men within our generation that can still guide us to the Geula. How? Because these men have what they call Daas Torah, a gift, as they teach, that is only transferred from one Adam Gadol to another, something that only someone completely immersed in Torah, i.e. doesn't work, can attain. Which is what? Which is basically, in their opinion, the voice of God in our generation. But we'll cover Daas Torah in a minute. But regarding the idea of Yeridos HaDoros, where does it come from? Is it from the Torah? Is it rabbinic? Or was it just made up? And friends, like I do in all my lectures, I will attempt to explain these ideas to you tonight for no other reason than for clarity's sake. And how will I accomplish this? Well, first by telling you the truth, i.e. bringing the facts, then giving my opinion, and then letting you decide. And friends, for anyone out there new to Orthodoxy, it would really especially benefit you to understand the ins and outs of these two terms of Yeridos HaDoros and Daas Torah, mainly because these are the two main justifiers used by rabbis today in endorsing post-Talmudic customs. And regarding Daas Torah, the reason you will never hear it called Daas Torah is because this is a primarily Litvish idea. Not that Sephardim haven't also adopted this idea for themselves, because they have, unfortunately. But anyways, friends, regarding Yeridos HaDoros, first and foremost, you must know that Torah Shebiktav, or Tanakh, in general, never mentions this idea or in any way endorses it. The idea that those that came before, by definition, are greater than those who came after. And you would also be surprised to learn that the idea also doesn't appear in Torah Sheba'al Peh. Well, at least not on how it's believed today. In other words, the idea that sometimes, in certain circumstances, there existed either a generation or a group of individuals who were greater or more important than the later generation. Of course, this does appear, but again, not as a rule, but only because of circumstance. And this is something that echoes through yeshivas even today. Arguments like, oh, do you think you know more than Rabbi X who lived before us? And surprisingly, this actually ends discussions in yeshivas. I would actually like to hear that someone had the guts to say that the Ben Ish Chai or Rabbi Shlomo Goren may have known more than, let's say, the Ravid in a certain area. I mean, why not? Why can't we say this? I mean, I personally heard rabbis brought into seminars to justify positions they have taken, and after they have explained what their position entails, when asked what source do they have for such a position, because yes, friends, in Judaism, everything we do needs to have a source, either tying it to Torah Shebiktav or Chazal, then they'll say, well, there was one rabbi who lived before us who did endorse it, and if you think you could argue with this rabbi, going against Yeridos HaDoros, and thus suffer the communal shunning that will follow, then go right ahead. And friends, this always seals the deal. And I would say that this form of ancestral veneration is responsible for the vast majority of weird practices we have in the religious Jewish world today. And friends, it's almost like the current Jewish world does not miss an opportunity to discredit and devalue effort and hard work every chance it gets, telling everyone toiling today in the effort of Torah that they, as a rule, will never surpass those who came before them, almost as silly as choosing leaders solely based on who they happen to be related to, just like the Hasidic movement does today with the whole notion of a Rebbe. Which is why we at Torah Judaism International devote so much time trying to clarify Jewish issues so that we, as a people, as an ethical movement, could finally begin to progress. So friends, today we will go through all the Talmudic references used to justify the idea of Yeridat HaDorot to really learn if there is a basis for this idea. So to begin with, one of the first statements used to justify Yeridat HaDorot is in Masechet Shabbat, Kuf Yud Bet Amud Bet. It states, Rabbi Zera said in Rava ben Zamuna's name, if the Rishonim were the sons of angels, we are the sons of men. And if the Rishonim were the sons of men, we are like donkeys. And not even like the donkeys of Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa and Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, but like other donkeys. And friends, this is one, if not the main statement used to justify the notion of Yeridat HaDorot. And really, why shouldn't it be? I mean, apart from it being pretty straightforward, it also fails to explain what it's really saying. In other words, all we know according to this passage is that the previous generation is being praised for no apparent reason. Now, based on this, we are able to infer that they being greater, wiser, and more connected to Torah is not necessarily based off of some principle, but most likely because of the circumstances they were in. Now, before I continue, I want to restate the point I'm attempting to make with this lecture, and that is that every time the concept of what we call Yeridat HaDorot is ever noted, the generational decline, even though it's never really called this anywhere in Talmudic literature, but anytime any idea slightly resembling Yeridat HaDorot is espoused, it is always referring to a decline based on a specific set of circumstances and never as a rule. It's like saying if I had a great-grandfather who became a world-renowned doctor and I only became a janitor, that doesn't in any way mean that my grandfather was intrinsically greater than I and thus became what he was just because he lived in an earlier generation. No, but rather I hope we today would assume it was because of different circumstances that arose from either him making better decisions or something similar. But I honestly think that no one today would assume it was because my grandfather was either spiritually or intellectually greater than I. And friends, this is how bad ideas and customs creep into Judaism. How? Well, first by acknowledging that all silly, baseless customs at one time had a beginning. In other words, only because an absurd, non-Torah idea may be thought of by a rabbi today and rejected straight out by this generation, that idea could easily become custom and possibly law by the next generation because of this notion of Yeridat HaDorot. In other words, by this new standard, because that rabbi existed in a previous generation, we would be forced to accept his rulings and ideas as not only superior but truer than an idea or any opinion espoused by any Rav today. When friends, even Shlomo Melech reminds us in Kohelet, Perek Zayin, Pasuk Yud, to not say that the former times were better than these, that it is not wise to ask such things. Because I'm sure you've heard it. Hey, this was said by Rashi, and are you saying you know more than Rashi? Or the all-famous statement said by people when they're cornered and they can't respond that, although I can't explain it, this idea was taught by my rabbi who is older than both of us, and which by definition means that he knows what he's talking about, and for sure is closer to Daas Torah than we are. And this, unfortunately, ends the discussion typically. And please don't confuse this with an attempt to say that the youth know more than their elders, because that's not what I'm trying to say. But what I'm saying is that knowledge and ultimately wisdom is graded and validated on a scale based on how effectively it is applied, and not just because it may have been said by some elder. To even quote a famous Jewish historian who said that we Jews prefer our heroes dead, which is really the basis of Yeridat HaDorot. Anyways, another Gemara typically quoted to justify Yeridat HaDorot is the Yerushalmi in Gittin in Perek Vav Halacha Zayin, which states, when Rebbe wanted to raise a question about an opinion of Rabbi Yossi, he said, should we, inferior people, raise questions about the opinions of Rabbi Yossi? For just as there's a difference between holy things and unconsecrated food, so is there a difference between our generation and the generation of Rabbi Yossi. Said Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, just as is the difference between gold and dirt, so is the difference between our generation and my father's. So here, again, it fails to state where did the previous generation's greatness stem from. And yet, another example, my friends, is found in Masechet Eruvin, Daf Nun Gimel, Amud Aleph, which states, Rabbi Yochanan stated, the intellect of the Rishonim were like the door of the Ulam, and today's scholars are like the door of the sanctuary, while ours is like that of the eye of a fine needle. By Rishonim, we meant like Rabbi Akiva, and by today's scholars, we mean like Rabbi Akiva's student, Rabbi Eliezer ben Shammua. Others said, by Rishonim, we mean like Rabbi Eliezer ben Shammua, and by later scholars, we mean like Rabbi Hoshea ben Ribi, while ours is like that of the eye of a fine needle. And we, said Abaye, are like a peg in a wall in respect to Gemara. And we, said Rava, are like a finger in wax as regard to Svora. We, said Rabbi Ashi, are like a finger in a pit as regards forgetfulness. So friends, here we see another clear veneration for the earlier scholars known as Rishonim by the later scholars. And again, the question is whether this in some way is trying to establish some sort of rule or reality that older and thus closer to Sinai always meant wiser and superior by definition, which my argument is that it is not. And a Rishon here, my friends, just means a earlier scholar. And I'll cover this later on how rabbis incorrectly used the term to depict rabbis post the 9th century to about the 15th century to better describe their supposed generational decline. And friends, the reason I decided to first post the sources usually used to justify Yeridat HaDoros is so you can see how clearly ambiguous they are regarding the doctrine that older by definition meant someone spiritually, intellectually greater. Now, here are some areas in Shas that begin to shed some light on how Chazal actually viewed previous generations. Right? First, we have Masechet Yoma Daf Tet Amud Bet, which states, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Eliezer both say, the Rishonim, i.e. the former ones, whose iniquity was revealed by the prophets, had their end revealed by the prophets, who stated that they would return after an exile of 70 years. The later ones, i.e. those who lived after the destruction of the Second Temple, whose iniquity was not revealed, have their end still unrevealed. Rabbi Yochanan said, the fingernail of the earlier generations, the Rishonim, are better than the bellies of the later generations. Said Reish Lakish to him, on the contrary, the later generations are better, although they are oppressed by the governments. They occupy themselves with Torah. He, Rabbi Yochanan, replied, the sanctuary will prove my point, for it came back to the former generations, but not to the later ones. The question was put to Rabbi Eliezer, were the earlier generations better, or the later ones? He answered, look upon the sanctuary. Some say, he answered, the sanctuary is your witness in this matter. So in this passage, the difference between both declines seems to be with respect to their devotion to Torah, not to some intrinsic worth. That the previous generation must have surpassed the later generations in Torah, which is why the sanctuary remained. In other words, if the intrinsic argument was relevant in any way, why do we have Reish Lakish clearly stating that the later generations were better, and the others responding to his statement on the basis of effortful meritness, right? Greatness versus the notion that they were intrinsically great, which is the argument that's made today. Also, we find a similar understanding of this argument of Yeridat HaDorot, of the decline of the generations, in Masechet Tainit Daf Chaf Daled Amud Aleph. It states, Rava once decreed a fast. He prayed, but no rain came. Thereupon the people remarked to him, when Rabbi Yehuda ordained the fast, rain did fall. He replied, what can I do? Is it because of studying? We are superior to him because in the time of Rabbi Yehuda, all studies were consecrated on Nezikin, whereas we study all the 6 sections today. And then the Gemara continues explaining how Rabbi Yehuda found a certain sugya difficult in the Mishnah, sugyot which were better understood by Rava in his generation, showing us that the notion of Yeridat HaDorot, if it did ever exist, did not include Torah wisdom. I mean, can you imagine a rabbi today claiming to know more in an area than a rabbi who lived in an earlier generation? I mean, he wouldn't dare make such a statement, although in my opinion, of course he could, and this is really what this video is trying to solidify in all you. But anyways, friends, the sugya continues. When Rabbi Yehuda removed one shoe as a sign of humiliation, preparatory to praying for rain, rain immediately fell. But when we cry out, no one pays heed to us. Is it because of some failing? If so, let anyone know of it.
declare it. What, however, can the great men of a generation do when their generation does not appear good enough to find favor in the eyes of God?
So here the decline appears to have been a moral or spiritual decline. And again, here we see that Rava in no way thought that he was inferior to Rabbi Yehuda, especially not because of some rule. So friends, little by little we're beginning to decipher the ambiguous statements incorrectly used by rabbis today to justify the baseless notion of Yeridat HaDorot. And friends, because of the kind of outreach I perform, I get virtually every imaginable question regarding our awesome belief system that you can imagine. But I would honestly say that the vast majority of the questions I receive really have nothing to do with Judaism at all. I mean, the person asking sure thinks it does. Questions like, why do so many Jews dress like Polish nobles of the 17th century? Or why do many people, after becoming religious, they change the way they speak, they adopt outdated social mannerisms, walking with canes, and even going as so far as seeing young men mimicking the behavior of senior citizens, right? Even passing gas at Shabbos tables. And friends, it's really endless. And it's really Yeridat HaDorot and Daas Torah that are the main culprits for this. But anyways, friends, another passage that sheds more light on the notion of the decline of the generations, or the supposed notion of the decline of the generations, is in Masechet Brachot, Daf Lamed Hey Amud Bet. It states,
Rava ben Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, see what a difference there is between the earlier and the later generations. The earlier generations made the study of the Torah their main concern and their ordinary work secondary to it, and both prospered in their hands. The later generations made their ordinary work their main concern, and their study of the Torah was secondary, and neither prospered in their hands. Rava ben Bar Chana further said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, see what a difference there is between earlier and the later generations. The earlier generations used to bring in their produce in such a way as to make it liable to tithe, whereas the later generations bring in their produce in such a way as to make it exempt from the tithe.
So here we see that Rabbi Yehuda seems to be emphasizing a pious superiority held by the earlier generations and the rewards for such piety. A piety, as it seems, based on effort and not mere intrinsic holiness. In other words, not an intrinsic piety or level of Torah knowledge. So friends, so far I think I've been able to shed some light on how Chazal would have felt about the modern notion of Yeridat HaDorot. And now I'm going to give you a few more passages that begin to clarify the issue even more. Right? Like it says in Masechet Yevamot, Daf Lamed Tet Amud Bet, where it states, we learned elsewhere, at first when the object was the fulfillment of the commandment, the precept of the Levirate marriage was preferable to that of Halitza. Now, however, when the object is not the fulfillment of the commandment, the precept of Halitza, it was laid down, is preferable to that of Levirate marriage. And again, friends, here is yet another example on how the greatness of the earlier generations is due to effort, describing the Levirate marriage and how the earlier generations performed the actual marriage, while the later generations performed chalitza, which is the only option available to Jews today, since the later rabbis forbade the act of polygamy, which only would occur if the male was already married. So again, here their greatness is completely based off of effort, like we said, and not intrinsic greatness or some unchangeable rule. Because, as it states in the same sugya, that Rami ben Chama said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, that the precept of Levirate marriage is preferable to that of chalitza. And friends, if you notice, I'm giving you the most ambiguous sources first, and then moving on to the more clear ones to completely slam this notion of intrinsic general decline and really place it where it belongs. As a matter of fact, the reason the majority of the references made regarding earlier generations are those that make them seem greater was due to the fact that the earlier generations had authentic smicha. So this in some way intimidated the later generations enough to set some sort of aura of unquestionable reference that can make us, the reader, or the readers of these statements, assume that there was something superhuman about these individuals. But again, it was mainly only because of the office they held, which by the following sources really should solidify this fact, as it states in the Mishnah in Eduyot, that no court may set aside the decision of another court unless it is first greater in number and in wisdom. And friends, This text would make no sense if it would have been impossible for a later court to be greater than an earlier court in wisdom and not just in number. And friends, when discussing this topic with others, you will see a lot of preconceived notions at play by the responses you will receive. In other words, they will quote much later opinions about what these passages in Shas really mean, which is why I'm sticking to the passages in the Gemara in the first place. Not that we are claiming that the opinions laid down by Chazal are intrinsically wiser and greater than who we refer to as Achronim today, but rather because Chazal developed what we know as Torah Shebal Peh. So we should assume that there is no greater interpreter of their own words than themselves. And again, because of circumstance. But furthermore, in Masechet Sukkah, Daf Chav Het Amud Bet, it states,
our rabbis taught Hillel the elder had 80 disciples. 30 of them were worthy enough for the divine presence to have rested upon them as upon Moses. 30 of them were worthy enough for the sun to have stood still for them as it stood for Yoshua ben Nun. And 20 of them were intermediate. The greatest of them was Yonatan ben Uziel. The least of them, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. They said of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai that he did not leave unstudied any scripture, Mishnah, Talmud, Halacha, Agadah, details of the Torah, details of the scribes, arguments and analogies, calendrical calculations and gematriot, the speech of the ministering angels, the speech of demons, and the speech of palm trees, Fuller's fables, fables of foxes, a great matter and a little matter. A great matter, the account of the chariot. A little matter, the discussions of Abaye and Rava in the fulfillment of the verse, that I may cause those that love me to inherit substance, and that I may fill their treasures. If the least of them was like this, how much more so the greatest of them? They said of Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel that when he sat and occupied himself with Torah, every bird flying above him burst into flame.
So here the point is that Hillel the elder had 30 students as great as Moshe Rabbeinu and 80 students as great as Yehoshua ben Nun. So clearly Chazal did not accept the idea of the decline of the generations. They couldn't have if Hillel's students were compared to Moses, or even Hillel himself was compared to Moses in Masechet Sanhedrin Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph.
Once, when the rabbis were met in the upper chamber of Guria's house in Jericho, a bat kol was heard from heaven, saying, there is one among you who is worthy that the Shekhinah should rest on him as it did on Moses, but his generation does not merit it. The sages present set their eyes upon Hillel the elder.
And today we can't even say that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef could not have been greater than any other rabbi of any previous generation. I mean, not even the Rashba or the Rashbam. I mean, really, friends, it's kind of silly. Actually, there are even countless of examples when the actual halacha is changed because of Yeridat HaDorot. Like when the Shulchan Aruch, on the basis of Yeridat HaDorot, changes the halacha regarding reciting the Shema.
He who marries a virgin is released of the obligation of reciting Shema for 3 days if he has not consummated the marriage, since he is preoccupied with the performance of a commandment. This applied during the time of the earlier ones, but nowadays, when other people, i.e. not newly married men, do not consecrate their intention on the performance of commandments as they ought to, even he who marries a virgin recites Shema. Friends, how dare they change the actual halakha just because they think they know better? The halakha is clear as it appears in Masechet Berachot, Daf Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph. Now, compare this to what the Rambam writes in Mishneh Torah. One whose mind is preoccupied and in an agitated state because of any religious duty which he has to perform is freed from the obligation of reciting the Shema. Hence, a bridegroom who has married a virgin is exempted from reciting the Shema till he has consummated the marriage, since his mind is not at rest, lest he not find her to be a virgin. If, however, consummation has been deferred till the night after the Sabbath, subsequent to the marriage, it is his obligation to recite from the night after the Sabbath onward, for his mind has calmed down, and he is familiar with her, even though he has not had intercourse with her.
And friends, if these sources weren't enough, we're going to continue the sources. Like it says in Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Bet, where it states that Ezra was compared to Moses. It states,
it has been taught, Rabbi Yossi said, had Moshe not preceded him, Ezra would have been worthy of receiving the Torah for Israel. Of Moses it is written, and Moses went up unto God. And of Ezra it is written, he, Ezra, went up from Babylon. As the going up of the former refers to the receiving of the Torah, so does the going up of the latter.
So I guess, friends, yes, today we may have become less wiser, especially regarding the attitude taken regarding Yeridat HaDoros, but it's clearly an area based off of effort or lack of it. Anyways, the same point can be inferred from Masechet Menachot, Daf Chav Tet Amud Bet, which states, Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, when Moshe ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be He, engaged in affixing coronets to the letters of the Torah. Said Moses, Lord of the universe, who stays thy hand, i.e. forces you to do this? He answered, there will arise a man at the end of many generations, Akiva ben Yosef by name, who will expound upon each tittle heaps and heaps of laws. Lord of the universe, said Moses, permit me to see him. He replied, turn thee around. Moses went and sat down behind 8 rows of students and listened to Rabbi Akiva teach. Not being able to follow their discussion, he felt weakened. But when they came to a certain subject and the disciples said to the master, from where do you know this? And the latter replied, it is a law given to Moses at Sinai. He, Moses, then was comforted. Thereupon he returned to the Holy One, blessed be He, and said, Lord of the universe, thou hast such a man, and thou hast given the Torah by me? He replied, be silent, for such is my decree. Then said Moses, Lord of the universe, you have shown me his Torah, show me his reward. Turn thee around, said he. And Moses turned around and saw them weighing out Rabbi Akiva's flesh at the market stalls. Lord of the universe, cried Moses, such Torah and such reward? He replied, be silent, for such is my decree. So in this portion we see that Moshe Rabbeinu was saying clearly that Rabbi Akiva was superior to him. Now I know that we are all familiar with the verse that says that a prophet will never arise like Moshe Rabbeinu. And this is true. A prophet will never arise like Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? But this pasuk is always taken grossly out of context. Because it doesn't say that a tzaddik will never arise like Moshe Rabbeinu, or a leader will never arise like Moshe Rabbeinu, or a wise man like Moshe Rabbeinu. Because all this, anyone could aspire to. No, but only that a prophet, a Navi, will never arise like Moshe Rabbeinu. So at least according to this medrash, we see that not even Moshe Rabbeinu would have accepted the notion of Yeridat HaDoros. And friends, if the previous examples were not enough, Masechet Sanhedrin Daf Lamed Chet Amud Bet should solidify it for you.
What is the meaning of the verse? This is the book of the generations of Adam. It is to say that the Holy One, blessed be He, showed him, Adam, every generation and its expounders of Torah, every generation and its sages. When he came to the generation of Rabbi Akiva, he, Adam, rejoiced at his learning, but was grieved at his death.
And friends, if the previous examples were not enough, how about when it says in Masechet Sanhedrin that the Tanaim had the power that the previous generations didn't have to enslave the Yetzirah, so that the later generations would not be drawn to practice forbidden relations, arayot, like the previous ones did, right? Does that in any way justify Yeridat HaDoros? Not that one must believe that all this actually happened, but it gives you just another peek on how Chazal viewed the notion espoused by rabbis today. And also many fail to understand when they choose to misunderstand these portions that they claim speak for Yeridat HaDoros, that this would be placing Tanaim themselves behind those who came before them. As we have shown, is nothing that is ever seen in Shas. In other words, history has been moving forward and not backwards. We've gone up and not down, at least for sure in our abilities. So does our piety match up with that of Moshe Rabbeinu's? Well, maybe not. I mean, we still don't have a temple, but this again is because of where we have chosen to be, unless they're willing to claim that the Almighty is going to have to lower His standards for us to merit another temple. I mean, honestly, especially in the area of learning, I mean, in Rashi's time in big cities, maybe they had one copy of the Talmud. They had, a couple Sidurim, and the Chumashim were scarce. I mean, come on, honestly. I mean, look nowadays, we have countless of hours of Torah lectures, we have MP3 players, access to Jewish texts backwards and forwards in any format. Friends, it's clear that Yeridat HaDoros is a myth. Now, many falsely assume that the reason Amoraim did not dispute with Tanaim as well as the Geonim do not dispute with Amoraim was because of this idea. And the truth is that the reason the Amoraim, like we said, didn't dispute Tanaim is because, again, Tanaim had smicha and were most likely members of the Beit Din, or most likely the Beit Din HaGadol, not because of Yeridat HaDorot. And this is why later rabbis have created eras in Jewish history like Amoraim, Geonim, Rishonim, and Achronim. Now, the title Amora, or the term Amora, did exist in the Talmud, but just as a descriptive term, as a lecturer's assistant. And Geonim were just the heads of the two yeshivot in Bavel. And it wasn't an era of rabbis in general on how they explain it nowadays. And also the notion of Rishonim and Achronim were completely made up out of thin air. Actually, even the term Tana, where we get Tanaim from, was not a title, but just a term used to describe a teacher mentioned in the Mishnah, from the Aramaic equivalent of the Hebrew word Shana, literally a repeater from where we get the word Mishnah. Now, we do find sometimes in the Gemara itself that it's used loosely just as teacher. And repeaters of what? Repeaters of what was passed down to them from the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah. So all these supposed eras, Zugot, Tanaim, Amoraim, Savarim, Geonim, Achronim, did not exist. All there was, friends, was judges and teachers with smicha and those without. So, friends, the reason the rabbis today created these eras from Tanaim all the way to Achronim is to also claim that we today could not question the previous generation, i.e. the European generation, that pretty much runs everything in Orthodoxy today. Which is why they reinvented the title rabbi and the smicha process in the 1500s. In other words, it was a ploy to trick the Jewish world into getting them to believe that they had power when in reality they didn't. Remember, smicha was abolished in around the 3rd century and all rabbinic authority along with it. Which is why the Rambam and any other teacher pre the 16th century that we know of would never have referred to themselves as rabbi. And you're probably thinking, what are you talking about, Asher? Rashi, Rasag, Rambam, what do you think the R in those names mean? Because the R in front of their nickname stands for rabbi. Well, friends, you would then also be surprised to learn that the form we have today of writing the names of rabbis in an acrostic fashion, like Maimonides being Rambam for Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, was only invented post the 16th century when Jews began to reuse the ancient title of rabbi, which was initially only given to men who had smicha. So Rashi would not have been known as Rashi, or the Ramban, or the Rashbam, or the Ravid would never have been known by these titles, because the title rabbi didn't exist at that time. Now, why do I call myself a rabbi? Well, because, friends, it's become institutionalized nowadays. In other words, nowadays, this is a title given to Jewish clergy. So because they reinstituted the ceremonial smicha in the 1500s, they have also developed study programs in schools geared to qualify you as a teacher or rabbi in the Jewish world. And yes, I have a couple of these ordinations or smichot under my belt. But anyways, friends, this notion of Yeridat HaDorot really culminated in the creation of the Adam Gadol, the individuals we call Gedolim nowadays, the great ones, literally, who then claim to wield their power with the invention of Daas Torah. So just as in the recreation of smicha in the 1500s, which gave them the opportunity to wield rabbinic authority in their minds by claiming to have the authority of the men of the Sanhedrin, the creation of Daas Torah and the role of Gedolim gave them the opportunity to wield the authority of Moses. So, what is Daas Torah? Well, Daas Torah, like we said, is not a term that appears anywhere in rabbinic literature. Actually, the term Daas Torah, the notion Daas Torah, was invented in 1917 by Agudas Israel as a way to wean power over the Jewish masses. So this neo-doctrine of Daas Torah teaches that the revered rabbis of our generation, i.e. the Gedolim, have a special connection to the rabbis of old, like an unbroken chain of insight that is transferred from teacher to student. And this, they claim, goes all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Again, this concept appears nowhere in the Torah, nowhere in Shas, and not even the Rishonim mention it. Now, smicha, like we said earlier, we know did pass down from Moshe Rabbeinu down to the last of the Tanaim, but Daas Torah is a new invention. Also, smicha only gave the power to a shofet, to a judge on halachic issues, unlike Daas Torah, which supposedly gives them the power to make infallible decisions on every given issue of life, and every Jew must obey. Actually, Gedolim themselves are sometimes even called Daas Torah. Actually, a Gadol is actually referred to nowadays as a Sefer Torah Chai, a walking Torah scroll. Yes, my friends, it's gotten this ridiculous. They also teach that Daas Torah can only be embodied by someone who is completely immersed in Torah, which in their opinion is only someone who refuses to work, and i.e. earn a living for themselves, and only learns Torah all day. A practice that every one of these supposed Gedolim claims is the destiny of every Jew, which is why nowadays you see the ridiculous, baseless practice of Jewish men, like we said, learning all day and sending their wives to work to support them. When throughout Jewish history, every Jewish scholar had a profession, right? The Rambam was a doctor, Rashi ran a vineyard. But again, because of Yeridat HaDorot, the Gedolim decided that today every Jew must learn full-time, a practice that was only invented really in the 1960s by Rav Aaron Kotler in the US and reinforced later by Rav Shach in Eretz Yisrael. Now, you must know that these ideas of Yeridat HaDorot, Gedolim, and ultimately of Daas Torah really only arose with the invention of Orthodox Judaism. In other words, one of the worst things that could have arisen in the Jewish world was the classification of Torah-keeping Jews as Orthodox, mainly by the Reform, which then categorized them as some sort of minority group, i.e. the Orthodox, because the Reform is a much bigger movement than Orthodoxy nowadays. And thus, being a minority group, there arose leaders who felt that we needed them instructing us in every area of life, i.e. the Gedolim. So this was really just a Litvish phenomenon, mainly because Hasidim had been living in such a fashion for centuries, before the Lithuanian German form of Judaism, what we refer today as Orthodoxy, was born. And the big question is, friends, where is the source? Now, one quick source that we'll typically toss out is the whole statement of Emunat Chachamim, of Emunas Chachamim, which appears in some versions of Pirkei Avos in the later added 6th chapter. So they use this to in some way justify Daas Torah. And really, friends, I don't know how someone could use such a completely ambiguous phrase like Emunat Chachamim, faith in our wise men, to justify the human veneration that has taken place with the concept of Daas Torah today. Or worse, they'll tie it into the mitzvah of Lo Tasur, as it states in Parashat Shoftim, in Deuteronomy 17, that we should not stray from the rulings of the court, which the Rambam and the Ramban and virtually all poskim here state that this only refers to the Beit Din HaGadol, to the Sanhedrin, to the great Sanhedrin, and not to rabbis of today. And regarding even our sages of the Sanhedrin, Chazal, no one ever made the assumption that they never made mistakes or gave erroneous rulings like they do with the Gedolim who supposedly have Daas Torah today. Because if this is the case, that why do we have Masechet Torayot or Chilchot Shegagot that clearly explain to us not only that Chazal did make mistakes in the past, but what was to be done when those mistakes were made? But we're supposed to believe that the decisions of the Gedolim today are infallible, or how they perverted the term tzaddik, which they apply to any of these Gedolim to mean someone who never sins, apart from the traditional understanding of the term, which, as brought down by the Rambam and others, which only meant someone whose good deeds outweigh his bad deeds. Actually, did you know, friends, how many Jews didn't leave Europe during World War II after they saw the writing on the wall because the supposed local Gedolim, under the guise of Daas Torah, compelled them to stay? Or how many Gedolim were for the evacuation of Gush Katif, right, by evacuating the yeshivas and the Jews, only to see it turn into the terrorist enclave it's become today? Or how many have made ridiculous pronouncements like making it forbidden to spank your child or to vote for a certain candidate? And friends, the list of ridiculous pronouncements goes on and on. And the funny thing is that if you ask your average rabbi about Daas Torah, he will support it. He will stand up for it. In other words, he will go out of his way to justify it. Now, friends, if we know that the term was never heard of before 1917, why does anyone feel that they have to justify it today? I mean, instead of just saying, hey, if it was made up 100 years ago, why do we need to justify it or explain it? Unless they have completely forfeited their opinions for the opinions of the Gedolim themselves, which would basically make everything they say questionable. So friends, Yeridat HaDorot is a myth. In other words, in life, no matter what area, you are only limited by your lack of effort, and that's it. And regarding Daas Torah, the only instructions we're required to obey are those brought down by Moses and the members of the Great Sanhedrin, who we so reverently refer to as Chazal. And anything outside of this is considered only opinion. Friends, for more information about everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.org. And if you're interested in converting to Judaism, which I encourage you to do, also visit TorahJudaism.org. Thank you.